I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully what I'm doing will give us plenty of time, give you plenty of time for questions. My name is Ben Chapman, and I'm the Director of Computing Resources, not a web designer. I'm the Director of Computing Resources at the University of Tulsa, College of Law. My email address, in case you can't read it, is bchapman@utulsa.edu, and there's a phone number there too. You can give me a call, and I'd love to talk about this stuff. What I wanted to, just to clear up, there have been some questions about what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about Zope. Zope is a web application server. It's written in a programming language called Python. Woo! David's ready. He's ready to go. Okay, Zope is written in Python. The P languages, Perl, PHP, Python. Zope is completely open source. Zope is owned by, run by a group of folks called the Zope Corporation. They used to be known as Digital Creations, like Dayton Hudson. Their product became their name, so now they're Zope Corporation. You can go to www.zope.org or www.zope.com. Now, one of the things I wanted to clear up quickly, Zope is not PHP, Perl, or just Python or ASP. Zope is an environment for managing websites, for creating pages. In the Zope world, they're objects, for creating objects within sites that are going to be served up via the web. Zope is all about through the web management, what they constantly call TTW, but through the web management, and that means that you go to a browser somewhere, you tack on manage to the end of the URL that you're interested in editing, and you supply the appropriate credentials, and you edit the page from whatever browser you happen to be at. I accidentally let the name of the dean off the page a little bit earlier during the conference. We changed that. He let me know. Zope is all about collaborative and secure teamwork. That's all kind of buzzwordy. What that means is it has a delegated security model. It means that you can create rights and permissions. I trust this so much that I even gave Tom Ryan an account on a tiny little part of my Zope server at one point. Now he owns me. No, the idea is that you create user accounts and you define privileges and permissions at that level only. And below, at that level and below, users can do certain things. Above that level, they can't. And I'll demonstrate some of that a bit later. Zope runs on Windows, runs on Unix/Linux, runs on Mac OS X. It is only about 5 megabytes in size to download. Everybody should go out to www.zope.org, even if you never plan to run this in a production environment, and download it and play with it. One of the nice things about it being written in Python is... Remember some years back where someone showed up with a slide that had someone screaming at every third slide? I'm back in that moment. Okay. One of the weirder things about this thing is it's like that in 5 megabytes, not only do you get Zope, which is written in Python, you get the Python interpreter to run it, because the assumption is that you might be new to Python. And so they download and they install Python, compile the Zope modules for you, and set you up with the ability to run your own little server off port 8080. In addition to serving up content via HTTP, it also provides FTP on port 8021 and WebDAV. There's another port used as sort of a remote debugger. All of this is built into this very small download. This is neat stuff to me. Yeah. Nice things about Zope. You don't have to throw out your existing environment to begin to play with. Let's say that you want to deploy it in conjunction with static content served off of Apache or the other one. And you can set up Zope, and what we use is mod rewrite and Apache to direct stuff onto our dynamic pages on into Zope, and then we deal with the other stuff using PHP or Perl or whatever, whatever we're messing with. The next thing about Zope, it is modular to the extreme. There are all sorts of little products, add-ons, things that get tacked onto Zope, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. But one of the key things you need to get your mind around, and was very hard for me for a long time, is this idea that everything on your website, every object, every page, every picture, is stored inside a Berkeley database, Berkeley format, a DB format database. That's a little scary. That's a little worrisome. If this file called data.fs goes away, so does your Zope. Well, it hasn't been that scary. We've been doing this for 3.5 years, and we've never had any problems with this. The flip side of that is, just for grins, I downloaded, again, I mainly work, so you know where I'm coming from, I mainly work in a Linux environment, at least in terms of what we're serving up. But just for grins, I did grab a copy of our data.fs, stick it into the little mini Zope running here on my Win2K box, and I was amazed, that it works pretty well. The idea that you can export the entire site in one whack and move it to something else is also pretty powerful. So that might alleviate a little bit of the scariness of it. The fact that it has a built-in FTP server is also helpful if you're trying to migrate giant chunks of content out of another system and into the ZODB, the Zope Object Database. That's what this big Berkeley file is. The other thing about creating it this way is that they move towards the concept called mountable storage, and this plays into a load balancing tool they have called ZEO. If your database, if all of your pages are decoupled from the file system, they're not out there in, user shared docs, HT docs, whatever. If they're in this database, that also means that you could design a new storage layer. And in fact, they've done that using Oracle. So if you hit a point where the Berkeley DB doesn't scale for you, you can purchase the ability to put everything inside of a monster Oracle box. By the way, if any questions come up, stop me and let me know. ZEO is free, and what it allows you to do is round robin a series of servers and tap the Zope, this classic sort of round robin DNS kinds of stuff. But it's a load balancing tool, and it seems to work fairly well. Additional functionality in Zope is obtained through the use of what are called products. The products are usually zipped or tarred and gzipped bundles of stuff that you unzip in a particular directory. You shut down your Zope server, you restart your Zope server. This new functionality is available for you. It is different than configuring new stuff for Apache. And in my opinion, it's a million times easier. As far as page layout and the language used to create pages with Zope, they use either DTML or now. DTML is the document template markup language, which looks a little bit like a very restricted version of Python. It might be a little bit reminiscent of PHP or something like that. The page templates are all XML based. They recognize that many people are headed towards XML. And then you can write in raw Python as well. One of the key concepts about Zope is something called acquisition. I've intimidated him. He won't go woohoo anymore. All right, but acquisition or environmental inheritance, which means that if you write an index.html think about the traditional server-side include sort of page design. June Liebert talked a lot about that yesterday afternoon, where you have a header, you have a left menu bar, you've got a block of content, and you've got a footer. A lot of us are familiar with that approach to designing websites. The content then is defined at each level of this hierarchy. You know, we've got academics, we've got courses, we've got admissions, etc. They edit a file called content. That content then is wrapped with server-side includes in a traditional web publishing environment to create the full page. Okay. Now the interesting thing in Zope is that it will look for those includes throughout the entire system. So if it doesn't find an index.html in the current directory, it'll go up one, and it'll keep going until it finds an index.html that can wrap this content. This is really neat because this means that you don't have to do things like, you know, the include equals dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash standard header dot HTML. You don't really care where it is as long as your pages can find it. And I'll show you a little bit of that. There's some hint, because this is a fairly odd concept, there is some hint, and it comes straight out of object-oriented programming, by the way. It's the idea that you can override object attributes at a lower level. But there's some hint they may be moving away from that. And again, I'll show you that in just a second. Okay, Zope at the University of Tulsa. I am fortunate to have a very small staff. Hi, guys. And a very small budget. Hi, guys. In the beginning, we had a very mixed environment. The university central computing group sponsored the main server for the campus. It, for historical reasons, is an IIS server. The first thing that we did at the law school is we got our own Apache server up and running. So then we began doing Perl, PHP, some PHP plus MySQL, whatever we could use to do the kinds of projects that I thought we needed to do. I also began using Zope initially just to manage the directory of staff. And that was all it was. It was just a staff directory. It seemed well suited for that. Then we went to the Native American Law program, who had been complaining about their inability to quickly update content on their site. And they seemed a good candidate for Zope, and so we had some good luck with them. And then we had great results with really an intranet site. It's where our secretariat, which are the ladies in the secretarial office, it's where they post notices of class cancellations, changes, assignments, all the traditional bulletin board stuff. And there's a product for Zope called Squishdot, which is quite a lot like Slashdot, for those of you who are familiar with Slashdot. And Squishdot seemed to be a perfect solution for managing this sort of announcement board, this kind of setup. And so we had these two small pilot projects where we had good success over basically one academic year. Fall of 2001, we had a new web initiative with no new money, another blessing in disguise. And I got 0.5 FTE new staff. So we hired a young lady who's a web designer, 20 hours a week. And given those constraints, it seemed to be critical to me that we hand over responsibility for content management as best as we could. And we trumpeted our success with the earlier smaller projects, which I really hadn't told anybody were done in Zope. I just said, here's some forms. If you go here, and you can enter your content and it'll work. Got the computer committee interested in this, got the dean to sign on. Then we developed a website redesign plan based on a book by Kelly Goto, G-O-T-O. I'm not 100% that's the correct pronunciation of her name, but she has a wonderful book called Web Design or Web Redesign that works. And it's a terrific book, Kelly Goto, and very useful. All right, I'm going to do a quick dummy introduction to the Zope management interface, but it looks like I've got a real network connection, so then we'll switch to the real site. When you go into Zope, the first thing, when you go into the management interface, the first thing you see is the classic two-pane. You've got a folder, a list of folders of content over here. You have groups of objects over here. And then you have tabs, contents, view, properties. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Security, and a very comforting undo, which you may not be able to make out. Zope supports essentially infinite undo. Woohoo! Unless you do something called packing your database. Some of you may remember that. If you do that, you can't get back. Ownership. Objects are owned, and that plays into the security model. And then find, which is really helpful for finding the objects you misplaced. Okay, to add objects with the Zope management interface, you select the particular type of object from a drop-down box on the right, and click Add. Also notice that you can cut, copy, paste, rename, import, export, select all, those kinds of operations within your Zope. So if you don't care about anything else other than serving up static content, you're just interested in funking up a bunch of pages and not writing yet another PHP script to help somebody manage a small collection of pages, I think this is worth looking at. It's especially worth looking at if you have access to, and I probably don't have that product installed. This was cut off my local machine and not off our server. We use an LDAP authentication scheme. There's an LDAP authentication adapter for Zope. And so I can give somebody access to a folder and not force them to learn a new password. This is a great thing and really helped out when we were trying to convince people this was something that was worth looking at. So if you don't want to do anything else except get away from writing or borrowing scripts off php.net or whatever, this part is kind of cool. Let's look at one other thing. Once you're actually in a particular document, you're editing an object within Zope. This is what you see. Notice the breadcrumb trail up at the top, which helps people navigate around the site. Again, on the left, we've got the traditional folder view. We've got an object title, and this is descriptive text. All of us have gone through the headaches of coming up with a reasonable naming scheme for objects within your website, which somewhat suggests what they do. In Zope, the objects are named with IDs. The ID is required as the object identifier for every object. The title is optional, but really useful, and is supposed to be the human readable part of this. And it's actually been, a useful thing for us. And then we're using here the most basic form of Zope content. This is a DTML document. I can put some code in it, but in this case, I haven't put a thing in it. It's a dispute resolution course description. We've got content inside the box. They click submit. The content is updated. And it, again, works very well for what we're doing. If you hate that approach to managing things, and a lot of web designers do, because they want to manage 100 objects and then funk them up onto the server, again, you can use FTP or DAV to get the objects into the database. It just shows up as an FTP server. Like, dump objects in. Also, if you've got giant collections of content, like for example, we have a bunch of streaming video files where I don't remember everything is stored inside this one Berkeley database, and I don't want to thunk in a 100 megabyte media file inside the database. And so it's also important to have an alternative there. There are file system-based objects, which give you views of folders on your file system via the Zope interface. So you can avoid, this actually can handicap you, and in my case it did, because when I pulled our ZODB off the big server and stuck it on here, because I don't have the same directory structure here, I lost access to some objects stored outside the ZODB. But given these additional things all help us, do our job, especially when we're migrating content into Zope, or if there are things that just really aren't appropriate inside the ZODB. All right, I'm going to focus on one little part of our site. I got the sign-off to do everything on our site. So, again, benefit of a small department and no money. I'm going to focus today on course descriptions. A decision you have to make when analyzing an object-oriented system is, are the objects provided with the system out of the box sufficient for your needs? Or do you need to create new objects? In our case, for creating a set of course descriptions, we thought, well, yeah, these are probably sufficient. We'll use a DTML document. That's a nice building block. To be honest, I would probably do this slightly differently, and that has to do with something called the catalog, which I'll talk about in a minute. But for purposes of what we're doing here, basic object. Okay, so we're going to create a basic object. We're going to use the DTML document. Okay, you've already seen an example of a DTML document. It gives us a title. It gives us an ID, of course, but we're not going to focus on that too much. And it gives us content. So those are two properties of the DTML document. It has a title property. It has a content property. The content could be anything, including HTML. Okay, in my case, I'm using plain text for other reasons, and I'll talk about that in a second. One of the really fun things about Zope is you can tack on other properties to even basic objects whenever you need to. Immediately, our registrar said, well, this doesn't work for us. We need to know some other things. Does this course meet a bar requirement? Is it going to be tested on the bar? Does this course satisfy our general practitioner recommendations? What about our corporate practice recommendations? Will this course satisfy any certificate requirements? What are the prereqs for this course? Back. Okay. Back to the drawing board, except that you don't really have to go back to the drawing board for very long with Zope. I added those in as properties. And this will make a little more sense in a second, I think, when I show the live one. The other thing that we needed was a way to search the course listings. Zope has a built-in search engine that's both full text and keyword searchable, and it's called the Z catalog. You've got to put up with a certain amount of cutesy naming in this thing. Almost everything starts with Z. We also needed some visual cues about the information that we're listing. Our students respond well to brightly colored objects. So we know we're going to have to do some icon designing, and maybe the icons get stored somewhere else, and maybe they get stored within Zope. I'm not sure about that. And we need some helper functions. We're going to need to write a little bit of DTML to display these objects. We might need a couple of Python scripts in order to return lists of prerequisites, for example, or other database-like things. And we definitely need to authenticate whoever is going to be entering or modifying this data so that the student doesn't get in and write, don't take this course, bunch of crap. Yeah. What I'm going to do now, this is after we're done, is we're going to switch over to Mozilla. The latest version of Mozilla, by the way, is very nice. That's a quickie overview of what our website looks like. When you click on academics, you get something. Okay. Then when you click on course descriptions, we're now within a Zope-driven site. That front page, again for historical reasons, lives on the IIS server. From this point on in, everything is being done via Zope. Typical introduction to the academic program, blah, blah, blah. Course descriptions. Okay, and here's our new Zopified description thingy. Okay, with some disclaimer language, but we want to make sure that they can search titles and descriptions. You know, if I want to do a search for native, we'll pull up any courses that have to do with Native American law, which is a very important thing at the University of Tulsa. So we want to make sure that that works for them. We want to do some express searches. Show me just the bar courses. I don't want any of that fluff here. And so here are all the bar courses. I told you pictures are good. B for bar, C for corporate, G for general. This is further proof that I'm not a designer. because I'm sure they would have come up with something better. One of the things that we can do is we can and each of those searches together, bar, general practice, and corporate. What are the core courses that just satisfy every kind of requirement? We click go. Here are the 7 courses that you should probably really look at fitting into your curriculum. And then the last thing that we want to deal with is we've got people who just like to browse around. Okay, and they want to browse. We offer 100 and something courses. They want to browse and they want to have that batched in some fashion so they don't get all 105 immediately, that sort of thing. So those were some design goals we met. Obviously, I'm not going to show you the ones we didn't meet. But those were the ones that we met. And so now let's look at how we did that. Okay, this is the academics folder. All right, remember before we were getting sort of the end user view of academics, and then we navigated into courses. Once we got into courses, we had the searchable list and we had the other stuff going on. So let's do that here. By the way, I created a custom object called a TU folder, which has some extra properties, and that little TU icon is attached to it. So ignore that bit of cuteness. So I'm in a folder-like object. Inside the folder-like object, we have a long list of courses. And we have some other stuff as well. We have an ACL_users folder. Most folks would get what that has to do with. That allows you to connect to our LDAP server. And only the registrar at this point, and us admins, is able to edit these course descriptions. Here's a course description. Okay, course 01, Administrative Law, study of the legal consequences of power and authority, etc. If I want to, I can go in here, edit this, save it. We would see it on the website. Just take my word for that. The interesting thing is here. When I click on properties, I can edit any of the properties associated with this course. And I didn't design any of this in the sense that I didn't have to create the interface that allows the sufficiently authorized user to get to this tab. They click on properties and they see the properties that this object has. This is an object with properties. This kind of thing is pervasive within Zope and will be more familiar to recent computer science graduates certainly than it was to me. But in any case, you have these properties and they can be ticked on and off. If you were designing this from scratch, you might make a much more beautiful administrative interface. And it would say for problems, call Ben, and this is our beautiful administrative interface provided by the IT department. But the point is, we didn't have to do a thing. This is part of Zope. This is built in. And it looks good and has been sufficient for my registrar, who's not a computer-oriented person, to enter all this data. I didn't do this. This is the second important thing here. I was not the one deciding who should, what's a health law certificate and qualifying course and some other stuff. All right. Now, the next question that might pop into your mind is, where is the list of certificates being drawn from? Where are the prerequisites coming from? How did that data get there? Okay. By the way, we know that we can select multiple items with the control key because this has a type. It's a multiple selection type. And I'll maybe mention a little bit about that in a second. So how did this data get there? And at some point, somebody's going to go, well, where's the SQL server? Well, there isn't one. The whole thing is a database, right? The catalog gives us indexed access to the database. There's no SQL involved in this thing. In order to get a list of our certificate programs, we'll start with the most basic thing. The certificates are sort of atomic in database terms. I mean, somebody just develops a new certificate, gets it approved. Somewhere somebody has to enter a list of those certificates. Our certificates is just a tiny little mini, non-threatening, very easy Python function that returns a list. Okay, it's a list of objects here.
Here is my file.
Okay, it's actually a little more complicated than that because it's a list of tuples. We won't spend a lot of time on that. Meaning that any of us who've had to deal with creating selection lists for websites, where you've got the option value equals, and then you've got the tags, know that it would be really handy to have objects laying around that would return two values, right? The value and the text to be displayed. 99% of the time, the value and the text to be displayed can be identical. Comparative and international law. We're going to search the catalog for comparative and international law. We're going to display comparative and international law to people. But in some cases, we can't have that. We don't want to do a search for not applicable. We want to make sure that we're doing a search for nothing. In other words, nothing got selected. Nothing should be run. So in that case, it's awfully handy to return little lists of two things at a time. And that's what this function does for us. But again, it is about there's no logic in it. Call the function, return some values. It's very, very straightforward. What's more interesting than this sort of atomic data is how do we create those other selection lists? And the other selection lists, there's a feature we haven't implemented yet. When offered. This is actually much more of a political thing than I imagined. And advertising when courses are offered is something that you do after great and long deliberation. And so we're not doing that yet. But let's look at something like this. We're going to return a list of all the course titles. You remember we had the titles, not the IDs, because the IDs are not very friendly. Course 01. Okay, but we have a list of titles. Administrative law, for example. What we need to do is search our catalog and pop up that list of titles, then make that list of titles available in the properties field. And that makes it much easier on the registrar. Okay, and it also means that you cannot add a title to a list of prereqs if we've deleted that title. And John Jorgensen talks about referential integrity periodically. It helps maintain that even in the absence of a relational database. And this is a very small snippet of Python again that says the list is a search of the entire course catalog. If you find and create a little counter variable called I, and I is just in the list, it's the title. Add the title, I is the object. We have a list of objects that are returned from this catalog query. Okay, if you get I, for every I guess, add the title to a list. When you're done, return the list. It's about, whatever it is, 9 lines of code. But that means that the person in charge of adding the property, of checking that property, checking to see what's a prerequisite, will always get the actual courses that are in our database. This is a little more than I actually intended to go into. But again, this is very sort of small stuff. The catalog itself provides the batching logic, so I didn't have to spend a lot of time doing the previous 30, next 30, that sort of thing. And that worked very well. Okay. When we're done, right, when we got this data back out, we need to display it somehow. And I'm going to the same sorts of sessions you guys are. And I'm thinking, boy, saving it inside the database in HTML, that's probably not very 2002. You should probably be keeping it as plain text because I'm going to WAP enable it. I'm going to XML it. I'm going to do something to it later on. So what I did was I wrote a small function. This function is DTML. This is Zope's templating language. Okay? And what I wanted to do, you remember we had that content that was perfectly plain text. We got a bunch of properties, we got a title, and we got the content. So we want to display that in a way that makes sense to a browser. And that means we're going to make it into HTML. And so what I do is I put a standard HTML header. Remember we talked about acquisition? You won't see this header anywhere except at the root of my site. But what you don't see at the top, when I say use this variable called standard DTML header, you won't see standard. Oh, that's funny. That would explain why it's not actually displaying. Excuse me. Standard DTML header. If you see that at the top of it's at the very root of the site, that will display the header for the course that gets called. And then it displays the text of the course in some reasonable fashion. You'll see we wrap the course description inside a paragraph tag. No, that's not perfect. Imagine a course description with 100 paragraphs. I'll deal with that later. The prerequisites. Look at what's happening in prerequisites. I'm saying in a list comprised of all the prerequisites for the course, throw out a list item identifier and sequence item, ignore that. That just means the object in the list, right? Whatever that current object is, there's a certain amount of indirection built into Zope kind of by default. Then close the list, end it, and go on. What that means is, remember we were creating that list of prerequisites? Okay, and imagine that some course has 10 prerequisites. We will display every prerequisite in a nice, unnumbered, non-bulleted list for them. And it all comes out of that object because Zope and Python, by extension, is very, very heavy in its focus on lists. We're manipulating lots of lists of objects here. And this is the kind of thing that you would normally do in a relational database system with a couple of different tables. But you have these multiple prerequisites stored inside, or the references to them stored inside the object. And in a very few lines of code, then I can display the object that I want to see. And I'm going to change my mind again on that. It was working before. Why change it? Okay. Let me go back and show you then. We'll browse down to. Okay, this is being pulled out of the catalog. Find me every object. Create a link to the object. Show it to me. So here's employee benefits, because we happen to be, let's go back to the beginning so we can see the one we've been looking at.
It doesn't seem to make much sense to me.
Okay, here's administrative law. Okay, we know all that content is plain text, but it's pulled the header from the root of the site. It's created a little breadcrumb menu through some other stuff we do. It's actually got a link to our web event calendar. We've got the text, and then we have the content, and then that little list that I was building, the prerequisites. Okay, for administrative law, apparently, constitutional law is a prerequisite. And again, that content is created by our registrar deciding to select that attribute, that property within the management interface. And at this point, usually people go, it's enough of all of this. Are there questions now about how this works? Or yes?
Quite a bad question, but what would you recommend for? I'm sure he's in the movie over there, but I'm not that familiar with Python. I'm more familiar with my person.
Well, I'm
wondering what you recommend aside from the O'Reilly Zope book. We're extremely proficient in Python.
Okay, I'm not very proficient in Python either. I'm not very proficient in Perl. I used to be okay at Pascal. Long time. I have a poli-sci degree. Okay. Yeah, well, that's the only thing showing my age. What I recommend actually for getting familiar with Python is python.org and the O'Reilly Learning Python book. I don't want anybody in this room walking out of here thinking you have to know Python, although we have some Python wizards in the room and on Technoids. You don't have to know Python to use Zope. Knowing Python makes it easier to get some core Zope concepts, like the way that Zope uses lists and the way that it iterates over sequences. This will also be familiar to you from Perl and the for each in associative arrays, that kind of thing. But I mean, I've used learning Python, but the other thing that I've used, and I'll step back to the mic. The other thing that I've used is Python itself. On Windows 2000, When you download Python, you get, for that matter, on any Unix, Linux, whatever, if you have Tickle installed, which is easy to install, you get a GUI IDE as part of Python. And so you wind up with syntax highlighting, editing, help on functions, some really nice things. It's called idle. By the way, Python does not come from the snake. It comes from Monty Python, the comedy troupe. So things tend to be named for people like Eric Idle. The Python group, the folks who wrote Python, Guido van Rossum, come out of a different tradition than Larry Wall. And I use Perl and Python both poorly. But they come from an academic computing science background. Wouldn't it be cool to spec a language that was strongly object-oriented, that enforced a consistent syntax? There is more than one way to do it, which is the mantra of Perl, is not as popular in the Python world. It is an academic language. And in that sense, again, to show my age, those of you who suffered through Python, through Pascal, remember that was a teaching language too. And that's the same thing with Python. In a sense, it is a teaching language, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It has tremendous and easy to understand object orientation. Again, this is an example of some code. I thought this actually might come up. This is an example of some code that I wrote because we were converting people over from Eudora 3.x to Netscape's Navigator Mail Client, or whatever it's called, Messenger now. The Eudora, or the Netscape address book import feature croaks if you have distribution lists in your Eudora address book. It handles single addresses fine, but it's so simple-minded that it fails if you're getting groups of names in. And so I wrote something to do that. One of the critical things to notice about Python, the thing that Joe Cure really does, is no semicolons at the end of every line. Okay? There are none. No semicolons. No mysterious punctuation, and none of that $, caret, underscore, bang stuff. Okay?
Curse words.
That we love. Yeah, none of the Perl curse words.
How evil.
In Python. What Python does that some people just cannot abide, I mean, just on some emotional level, they just cannot handle. Python requires you to indent, to define flow of control within your program. You must indent. In fact, it will throw an exception if you fail your indentation. So notice here, what I'm doing here, it's string.find my line there. If we found some stuff, go on. Otherwise, don't go on. But anyway, if, else, here's a result. I'm saying give me the result, everything after the first element, return this result. This is a function up here. Define parse line, my line, return this function. The language is very, very clean. Very easy, for me at least. And again, I'm not very good at this sort of thing. And the language is really, really clear. And if any of you out there are not using sort of a utility programming language or scripting language already, I think you could do a lot worse than Python. I've tried. Python is the first object-oriented language that I've actually gone, oh, no, I get it. I did not have that experience with Java. And again, it's probably me. But yes, Joe.
One interesting thing about Python is it's deliberately designed without a go-to state. So if you want to program without a go-to, you're in good shape.
It is just such a nice,
Better basic.
a nice language.
How much better basic?
Here, let me go.
Basic is all of those.
I want to go beyond. Yes. Okay. I can't. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
If you're running it on an NT box, can you use NT domain security for authentication instead of LDAP?
There is a pluggable module that is supposed to do that. I haven't focused on that, so I wouldn't guarantee. Oh, David's back there going,
You can do it. You can do it, but I would prefer to do that.
The LDAP module is just a hoot. I mean, it really. No, I'm serious. It is very neat. I mean, I get a fairly granular control, based on the LDAP authentication we're all dealing with.
One of the models that integrated this with other databases that you may have.
We have integrated it with John Haywood's faculty bibliography that he did a presentation on a couple of years ago. And in fact,
Yeah, what does it look like now? What have you done?
it looks, I haven't done anything to it. It was so good the first time that I just had to write a little shell around it or something. But there's a MySQL database adapter, as Joe, as other people will tell you, getting the MySQL database adapter, which is part of Python, installed properly is a pain. Once you get that done, there's also adapters for ODBC and for Postgres, and others I'm sure. But once you get that done, it's really quite nice.
I'm taking one link, I can have it appearing in 20, 30,
Other questions about Zope? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm not a programmer at all, so I don't do that much with this kind of stuff. So this looks very interesting to me. So we do have a Linux box that we turned FTP off of because of security concerns. What security concerns do I have if I have this FTP running with this? Do I need the FTP running with this to make this work?
No, you absolutely don't. You can turn it off. It sits on a perfectly well-known FTP port, 8021. And I turned off my firewall just so that I could do this while I'm up here, guys. And it will go right back up in a minute. We limit it to on-campus access or via our VPN. But hold on, just bear with me one second because I want to show this FTP integration, or not the faculty bibliography queries. Because I was writing a kind of you got the general flexible faculty query. This has not seen the light of day. There's a reason. Let me show you just a second. All right. Let's say it would be kind of nice to select your faculty and do, I don't know, side-by-side comparisons of output. Or let's say everything after 2000. Okay. Whoops. I've got to select at least somebody. Let's, okay. No, this is just a test, and I apologize in advance, Gary Allison is the guy. This was before I got quite as fancy with the way that I do my feeding stuff into the queries. So I'm going to select, I have to select everything that I want to see back out, I think. Okay, go.
How hard is it to do that in Zope?
That was actually really quick. And this is
How long
where...
it took me in PHP to do that?
Well, I mean...
No,
it's just a different framework. I mean, you're just working inside a different framework. And now here's a report, and apparently since 2000, this particular faculty member has written this article. I can show you a little bit, I guess, about what all is in here. One of the really nice things, okay, we're doing selects there, and then I'm actually calling the query.
Yes, I could.
Options menu, let's look at that. The report is what we want to look at. One of the nice things about Zope as far as SQL queries is there's an SQL query wrapper that takes into account the fact that you may not be querying on a particular term. So it handles the and where thing fairly transparently, which is pretty neat. Now, let me see if I get this right. That's, of course, the problem with doing something you haven't pre-scripted. Okay, there's my query. Recent pubs by active faculty, I think, is what I was doing. Okay, this is SQL. right? And you guys can see select, blah, blah, blah. I'm pulling them from the table. But you see that DTML dash SQL group where and that will construct a valid SQL query regardless of the number of query terms I put in. This saves me the intermediate step of collecting data, analyzing what I got back as far as what the person wants to look at, and then building the SQL query by hand and submitting it. It also handles some nice type coercion issues transparently. But anyway, I'm kind of off track, I think, on that part. Yes, going on. All right, catalogs, we've done all that stuff. Zope Online, go to www.zope.org. One of the nice things about the Zope, there's a Zope mailing list there. The Zope mailing list is friendly. It is not hostile. There are some of this sort of in-group stuff, get out of here, newbie. But they're really not like that. They're very, very helpful. The other thing to know about Zope, an important thing about Zope, is that Zope essentially bought Python. Python is open source, but Guido and his friends, the Zope Labs crew, are all employed by Zope. For some years now, people have been touting Zope as Python's killer app. And they must have agreed because they brought that group over. Yes, sir.
The IRC chat channels are also really friendly.
That is another great suggestion, and you'll get guys who are actually the Zope developers on there.
They'll actually take your ideas and put them in the product, like right there in front of you. It's kind of very cool.
Okay, now there's a couple of other things that I want to mention. The Zope how-tos. Zope there is a Zope portal product that includes workflow and some other things called the Content Management Framework, which I'm not talking about today. It is a monster thing all in its own right. But if you go to www.zope.org, it's actually run by this software, the Content Management Framework. And so you can do a search for how-tos. The how-tos are invaluable. They're terrific. If your development work is done in Windows, some wonderful guy from Argentina took all of the how-tos and the Zope book, which I'm going to mention in just a second, turned it into a Windows help file. And it's very handy to have it when you're offline. It's just very nice to have it on your desktop. It's called the Zope Shelf. The Zope mailing lists are great. Open source software has a reputation as being poorly documented. This is not the software that will change that reputation. It's not great in terms of the documentation. The mailing lists are terrific. The discussions that go on there are just great. Books you probably should look at if you're interested in going further with this. The Zope book. It's the canonical reference work for Zope. It's written by two guys who've been with Zope since it was called Bobo. Crazy marketers. They thought Zope would be better. But anyway, it is a deeply frustrating and flawed book that you need to have. David's nodding his head. It assumes a level of familiarity that is really not there, was not there for me when I got the book. The second one is called Zope Web Application Development and Content Management. It's tremendous. It's also published by New Writers. It's an absolutely great book. You cannot get it online. The Zope book is available online. And if you need the Zope book, read it online and print this monster PDF out. Go buy this one. This one is really good. And just before I came up here, you were mentioning another one, right? Was there another that was not, it's not New Writers.
No, somebody else was.
There's a No Start thing. I think No Start.
That's fine. And that one I don't know. Good. Learning Python, again, is a good reference for Python. But one of the good things about the Spiegelmeyer book is the first several chapters are about downloading and installing existing products that satisfy a particular need, like the Zope UBB. Okay, it's a version of UBB for Zope, which is a bulletin board system. The Zope calendaring stuff that they've got. The wikis. another totally interesting side topic I'm not going to go into. There's a wiki product for Zope called ZWiki. That's fabulous, a collaborative commenting or whiteboard system. But anyway, his first several chapters are not about programming Zope. They're about setting up Zope, getting Zope to run, and then adding these pre-built components. And if you can run a Windows installer, you can add the components in. Once they're added in, they're always available from that Dropbox, like the canned products that come with Zope. That's a beautiful thing. Again, you're not sitting there figuring out how you're going to educate your users on the new way to use the WYSIWYG thing. It's just there. So it's really good. Python, python.org. There is a Python tutorial for non-programmers written by a kid as an honors project at Montana. And I really think it's excellent. This presentation, of course, like all the CALI presentations, will be posted somewhere. But it's really good. And a nice introduction if you're not a programmer. You could wrap up, your desire to learn more about regular expressions into your desire to learn a new programming language and go with Python and regular expressions all at the same time. There's a Python tutorial for programmers that's good too. Learning Python I already mentioned. Conclusions. This is a mature product. I have been using it since Zope 1.01. It is now at Zope 2.7. We've been using it over the last 3.5 years. There will be a new Zope 3 coming out next year that has some interesting changes. It has corporate support. If you guys have money, you can buy Zope, the Zope Corporation to come in and make this work for you. It has community support, terrific community support. It's free, it's rich in features. The challenges, it is different. Okay, now if you spend all your time learning how to script a website in PHP, those skills transfer only peripherally. I mean, the idea of looping constructs, yes, that transfers. The rest of it, it's a different approach. Our central IT group, while they were looking at various portals, got introduced to Zope. It was the wrong way to introduce Zope to them because it does not compete in the same space as maybe Vignettes products or some of the monster portal software that's out there. It is different. It's a little bit unique. My end users who have no preconceptions about what website management should be like have had a terrific response to it. They really like the ability to get there and change stuff around. We do have some difficulty with another aspect that I'm going to mention in just a second. The learning curve is steep enough to keep this from being a tool for your home site. My daughter refuses to use it. It's overkill for a really small site. If your site is growing into the hundreds and thousands of pages and you're really seriously wondering how you're going to manage all that content, you should at least take a look at this, I think. The very last thing I'm going to leave you with, I'm not going to demo because, well, yeah, I will. Let me go back up to, see if I can get back up to the root of my site. Zope has a tremendous concept called structured text, which most web designers hate with a passion. What structured text does, look at my naming scheme, huh? Okay. What structured text does is it allows you to use traditional ASCII art and indentation and double stars and underbars and things like that to suggest the way that text should be rendered in a browser. I've got end users who use structured text and like it very much. Again, our designers don't. The idea here is to make it just as easy as possible for people to get text into Zope. And they get text in by using indentation, by drawing tables, by creating lists with dashes. The same way we, pre-HTML enabled email, would convey meaning, and a lot of us still do, convey meaning in our email. Let me show you what this looks like when it's rendered. Okay, so here's the Zope management interface view of a structured text document. You can see the table. You can see it's emphasized, strong, underlined. Look at the link format. Here's the text of the link, here's the actual site. When we click on view, we get this out. Now you have to keep in mind, of course, this is being wrapped in my standard footer and header. A style sheet is being applied to it. But we're getting lots of interesting stuff back out for a relatively small investment of end user time, which is what it's all about. The reason I only mention structured text at the very end is you can do everything in Zope without structured text. Shouldn't confuse Zope and structured text. I had a mini riot in our library. Hi, Christy. When they said, well, we can't make it look the way we want. This is the person who's learned enough HTML to make things look the way they want. And if you're in that situation, structured text may not be the way to go. There's not an either or. It's available there as another tool. And it's a small part of Zope, but an interesting part as well, I think. So that's it. That's my presentation. If you've got additional questions or comments or whatever, I'll be here for a little bit. Thank you all very much.